Manchester City face off with Chelsea today in a match that I think is genuinely interesting, not just on the pitch, but off it as well. I think there's something quite interesting to see here as City potentially face off with what their future could become. Now, I'm going to talk through what Manchester City's success has been in recent years, how Chelsea were sort of here, and how they eventually collapsed, ultimately leading to are Manchester City doomed to repeat the same? First, I'm going to go through Manchester City's current successes because it is undoubtedly present and you have to admit the new ownership, they've been there for 15 years now, have been fundamental when it comes to Manchester City growing and becoming a big part of the league. For example, they've not left the top five since they were bought out by the UAE. That is absolutely insane. The fact that the top four clubs, at the very least, always get European football, Champions League specifically, means that they always have that as a stream of revenue that they can focus on and use to reinvest in transfers rather than just being reliant on oil money owners. Considering there is all of that money coming in, they are able to reinvest it in transfers rather than saying, look, we're just a club that's been paid for by the owner. In addition to that, they've won 6 of the last 7 Premier League titles, with the only one that they didn't coming, I think, at the hands of Liverpool in a very, very tight title race. And in addition to that, they've won 7 doubles in the 15 years since. Aside from that, they've also won 1 domestic and 1 continental treble, and in those, I've not included the Community Shield once. They have won so many competitions, it is absolutely insane. And if anything, it's the way that an owner looking to buy a football club, it's the model to follow. It's been perfectly done from the very start with incredible recruitment, good choices in terms of staffing, and consistency. However, you have to consider that Chelsea were also here at one point. Bought out by Roman Abramovich in the early 2000s, they were the initial money club. They were the club that were bought out, spent a shitload of money on a lot of very, very good players, and eventually won absolutely everything there was to win. But they're not there right now. So what happened? First up, we have to note the significant shift in structure. They went from being owned by Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich, who sold up due to the war in Ukraine. I'm quite glad, to be honest. It's quite good not having Roman Abramovich owning a football club and lots of people being apologists for him. They still are, but that's only because of what followed with Todd Bowley buying out the club. It also led to a lot of the senior members of staff being rotated out, and that is damaging for the consistency in the club. In addition to that, there were a series of very, very poor purchases. Mikhailo Mudryk for, I think it was £80 million, was definitely not worth the money. I'm just going to very quickly have a look at transfer market to see the bad mistakes that they have made in recent years, because there's a lot of them. In addition to that, Moises Caicedo being squeezed for £120 million for him. Romeo Lavia may turn good, but he was 50-something million pounds off the top of my head. The page has now loaded, so I'm going to have a quick look. Enzo Fernandez, almost certainly not worth €121 million. Wesley Fofana, €80 million from Leicester. Marc Cucurella for 65. Badiashile for 38 isn't that bad, but Koulibaly was the same cost. These are huge transfer fees for players that just do not justify it. In addition to that, you have a sheer lack of managerial consistency at Chelsea. They went from retaining Thomas Tuchel and saying, you can build, it's fine, who got a couple of months with his players that he bought throughout that first transfer window, who was then rotated out when Graham Potter came in, and he didn't have the players that he wanted because he wasn't in charge of that previous transfer window, so he couldn't get the team working the way that he wanted them to. And then they thought, shit, Potter isn't working, and moved on to Frank Lampard for some reason, which seemingly just a stopgap, which sort of makes sense because he's not going to be a long-term manager, and you can tell from his performances he did not deserve to be a long-term manager. But that's just a sign of the sheer lack of consistency, and they seem to be sticking with Pochettino. They seem to not be moving away from him for no apparent reason this time, but he's also gotten to spend a hell of a lot of money. Cole Palmer, Disasi, Nicholas Jackson, and a lot of these players are not paying off, at least in the short term. In addition to that, there's a real failure to apply long-term commitment here. Graham Potter basically said, this is going to be a long project, and they gave him something like 6 to 8 months and said, this isn't good enough, when he initially didn't have that first transfer market. You can't give a builder the baker and say, you can do the job. It's not going to work out. And that ultimately all came around to lead to relatively poor in-club morale. After all, when you're losing week after week after week, you're not gonna say, "This is fine. We can keep on going." And the players are eventually gonna revolt. The manager doesn't know what he's doing, but then again, you've got 40 odd players in the dressing room. You're never gonna keep everyone happy because not everyone can get that match time that they deserve. It's a real pain, to be honest. And the real question at the moment is, can this happen to Manchester City? And in theory, it can, but I'm going to take a quick look at whether or not it will, because I think that's the slightly more important way of looking at things. Anything can happen. Will it? Bigger question. First up, do they rely on Pep Guardiola? I think they really do at the moment. A lot of their success over the last few years has come from Guardiola. They have been at the very, very pinnacle since Guardiola came in. And that's because I think he's the best manager in the world. He's probably the best manager the Premier League has ever seen. And that sheer consistency is something that definitely holds Manchester City up there. The next question, are the ownership at any real risk of leaving? I don't think so. This is, I think, the most successful case of sports washing in the world because a lot of people have forgotten that it's sports washing. Within 15 years, people have gone, that's basically fine. They've moved past it. They've gone, okay, this is just Manchester City now. And eventually that'll happen with Newcastle. And it's a shame because it's something that desperately needs to be held to account. I don't see them leaving purely because Manchester City is not making money, but it's clearly been a good investment. You can see, come on, words. For example, Qatar might eventually pull out of PSG because they're not going to win the Champions League because they've not got the competition around them in France. And in addition to that, in terms of the leadership, I don't think they've got any director of football issues. I think it's Siki Begiristan or something at Manchester City. Apologies if I've pronounced that wrong. But he is one of the most consistent directors of football that I've ever seen. He's had one or two failures in terms of transfers, including Calvin Phillips, but that was more of an injury issue and the fact that he didn't click with Guardiola. The fact that he was a player that previously worked in a Guardiola-esque system under Marcelo Bielsa is really telling of the fact that it should have worked. That's not an issue with the director of football. That's a slight issue with what's happened after the fact. I genuinely think, in terms of director of football, Manchester City are sorted for the future because they've got someone that knows what they're doing. And that includes through youth recruitment, through buying for the senior squad and coaching staff, because everything seems to be completely perfect there. Enzo Maresca, for example, left as a Manchester City coach and is leading Leicester to the top of the Championship at the moment. The fact of the matter is, everything at Manchester City is so finely structured that, yes, in the rare event that the ownership give up, things can collapse. And if Pep goes, maybe they don't find a perfect replacement. But if they do, I can see them keeping this rolling. If the director of football goes, maybe that's a bigger issue. But I don't see a reason that he would go at the moment. Ultimately, they're probably fine. I know that this is an entire video about them being probably fine, but I think it's an interesting little comparison to have. By the way, I think Manchester City will absolutely batter Chelsea. It doesn't feel like it'll be very close. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. If you like it, comment down below what your thoughts are. If you're interested in Man City, Chelsea, club ownership, that sort of stuff, I'm happy to dive into it a hell of a lot more. Subscribe and maybe even become a channel member. Be hugely appreciated if you would. Hope you enjoyed. I will see you next time.